At 2 in the morning, the inclinometer started screaming, and Noelle Aoki stopped being a retired woman with a watercolor hobby and became the only person on the mountain who knew exactly how many minutes the houses below her had left. She did not panic. She had spent 30 years reading the slow handwriting of dying things, and she knew that panic was just arithmetic done badly. She pulled on her boots, woke Chucho on the second ring, and started down the switchback road in the rain with a flashlight and a list of 7 addresses she had written out 3 days earlier, in pencil, hoping she would never use it. 6 months before the slope woke up, there had only been the fog and the chainsaws. Noelle had come to the cove on the western slope of the Blue Ridge to count tree rings for pleasure and paint the mist for no one. After 30 years as a dendrochronologist, reading drought and fire and flood out of the growth rings of old timber for a federal climate lab. She was 58. She had bought a small house at the bottom of a hollow where the clouds came down the mountain every morning like something poured. And Laurel Bluff, the gated community of glass and Cedar Mountain villas terraced up the slope above her, had seemed, from below, like someone else's problem. The chainsaws started on a Tuesday. By the time she climbed the switchback, a crew had already dropped the great oak that stood at the top of the common boundary, the one that had to be 300 years old, its trunk wider than a car. Tansy Caldwell stood in a spotless rain shell directing the work, a laminated page pressed in a sheet protector against the drizzle. "Hazard tree," Tansy said before Noelle could speak, in the bright, firm voice of a woman who had decided the matter was closed. "Certified arborist's report. It threatened the homes and, frankly, it ruined the sightline. All by the book." Noelle did not argue. She did the thing 30 years had made automatic. She walked to the fresh stump, and she looked at the wood. Water was weeping out of the cut face, dark and steady. And the rings. The rings were wrong in the way that told a whole story to anyone who could read them. She asked the foreman, in front of Tansy and the whole crew, to cut her a full cross-section off the butt log, and to mark the compass direction on it with his lumber crayon before it left the stump. Uphill side, downhill side, labeled, and he did it where everyone could see, because no one tells the small, calm grandmother no when she is standing in the rain being specific. She photographed the cut, the crayon marks, the stump, the slope, the time. The chain of it mattered. She had testified before. She knew that a thing is only evidence if you can prove where it has been every minute since it left the world. She carried the disc home on both arms like a sleeping child and set it to dry on her kitchen table. Even damp. The story was there. Reaction wood, the dense, off-center growth a tree lays down when it is fighting to stay upright, built up ring after ring for a century and a half, the whole trunk leaning its strength against the downhill pull. The oak had not been falling. The oak had been holding. It had braced itself against a slope that had been trying, slowly, for a very long time, to move. She went up the next day to ask, reasonably, to see the report that had killed it. Tansy produced it, laminated. A certified arborist, a finding of structural failure risk, imminent hazard to dwellings. Noelle read it twice. The date of the inspection was 4 days after the felling had already been scheduled on the work order stapled behind it, and the arborist's letterhead carried, in small gray type at the bottom, the same sweet address as a developer called Ridgeline Equity. The association office told her the tree had been on the common boundary and the board had voted. The county sheriff's deputy told her it was a civil matter and she should take it to court. It was the sentence she had come to think of as the sound a system makes when it would rather not understand a thing. That night, she finally went into the shed and unrolled what the previous owner had left. Old USGS aerial photographs of the cove going back decades. She laid the oldest one under her desk lamp, and her hands went still. There was a scar on the slope under Laurel Bluff, an old landslide body, healed and grassed over and built upon, its lower lip, its toe, the place where a moving slope locks or lets go, sitting exactly where the great oak had stood for 300 years, holding the whole thing shut like a thumb on a spring. The association's answer to her questions was a fine, $200 for removing timber, her cross-section, from common property. Then a threatened lien on her house. Then, after the first hard 3-day rain, the cracks came. Hairline fractures stepped through the retaining walls above the villas. A row of young birches up the slope began to lean the same drunken way. The new asphalt on the switchback developed a long, slow wave in it, like a swallowed breath. Tansy sent a newsletter. Ordinary settling, it said. Do not spread alarm. Alarm hurts everyone's values. Del Burnside found Noelle at the cracked retaining wall, with her hand flat on the concrete, feeling for what she couldn't yet see. He was 74, the last man living who had worked the old sawmill at the bottom of the cove. "This whole hollow creeps," he said, as if continuing a conversation started years ago. "Always has. That oak was the anchor. Mill kept a book on it, measured the lean off a benchmark every spring for 40 years because the log road kept buckling." He looked at the stump up the hill, raw and pale. Somebody just pulled the cork. Chucho Vargas was 31, on the county road crew, and could not leave a moving thing unmeasured. He drove an inclinometer probe into the slope above the villas and ran ground-penetrating radar across the toe. And what came back made Del sit down on his tailgate. The ground was already moving, millimeters a day, accelerating with every rain, the deep failure surface sliding right along the old scar the aerials showed. The numbers matched the rings on Noelle's disc, the way two truthful witnesses match without ever having spoken. Audrey Lamb, a construction and environmental attorney out of Asheville, read the whole pile in one sitting. The dated work order, the backdated report, the aerials, Del's mill ledger, Chucho's inclinometer logs, and set her pen down with the care of someone handling something live. "Let's be clear about what this is," she said. "A felling on a fraudulent hazard report is bad. A felling that destabilized an active landslide above occupied homes is a danger to human life. And if a developer knew this slope was moving and sold the upper lots anyway without disclosing it, that's not a tree dispute, that's fraud. And it's the kind that goes federal." She uncapped the pen again. "Cease and desist. An action for the dangerous condition. An emergency motion to compel real-time monitoring. And we put every soul in those houses on notice, in writing, today. Because the moment we know and stay quiet, we become them." Discovery opened the mountain up. The subpoena duces tecum to the association and to Ridgeline Equity dragged the real shape of it into the light. Ridgeline had commissioned a geotechnical report years earlier, a real one, that identified the cove as a reactivatable landslide, and had buried it, and kept selling the terraced upper lots with a written guarantee of unobstructed ridge views. The great oak had ruined those views. So Ridgeline had paid its captive arborist to call a healthy, 300-year-old anchor a hazard and had it cut. And Tansy Caldwell, who had personally promised those views to every buyer, who carried a second mortgage she could not discuss, had signed the order because the alternative was being the woman who had guaranteed something she couldn't deliver. Then Noelle laid the oldest aerial over the newest survey and understood the part that stopped being professional. Her own house, at the bottom of the hollow, sat on the runout, the exact path the debris would take if the toe let go. She had not bought a quiet place to paint the fog. She had bought a seat at the bottom of a loaded slope, and the cork had already been pulled above her head. Ridgeline did not retreat. It hired a geotechnical expert who produced a glossy report concluding the tree was not a material factor, leaned on Chucho through the contractor that employed him until he was warned to stop moonlighting, and moved to bar Noelle from using the cross-section at all, calling it improperly removed evidence. Audrey killed that motion in a single filing. The disc had been cut in the open, in front of 7 witnesses including the association's own foreman, compass marked at the stump, and photographed continuously. A cleaner chain of custody, she noted dryly, than the backdated report the association wanted to rely on instead. The court agreed. The oak would be allowed to speak. Tansy and Noelle met on the slope 2 days later, in a gray noon drizzle, not over coffee and not at anyone's door. Tansy had come up to photograph the cracks for an insurance form, and she found Noelle already there with a level, watching a fence post that was no longer plumb. "It's settling," Tansy said, but the firmness had gone out of it. "Soil settles." "Soil settles down," Noelle said. "It doesn't settle sideways." She held the level against the post, so Tansy could see the bubble ride hard to one edge. And Tansy looked, really looked, at the crack stepping under her own villa's deck for the first time, the deck whose view she had sold, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing left in the script she had been handed for this. The court granted part of what Audrey asked. It froze further clearing and the sale of the upper lots, put a lis pendens on the parcels, and ordered independent monitoring. It did not order an evacuation. The slope, indifferent to the docket, kept moving. Which was why, 3 nights later, when the dying edge of a tropical storm parked over the Blue Ridge and dropped 4 inches of rain in 6 hours, Noelle was awake at her kitchen table watching Chucho's telemetry climb. At 2 a.m, the displacement rate jumped off the chart, the slow creep going suddenly fast, the signature of a slope about to let go, and the inclinometer alarm went off. She did not call the sheriff first. She had learned what the sheriff was for. She called Chucho, who was already pulling on boots, and then she went down the switchback in the rain with her flashlight and her penciled list of 7 houses, and she woke them 1 door at a time, not with fear, with numbers. The slope is moving. You have minutes. Take the cars, go up the county road, not down. Dell took the far end of the row in his truck, leaning on the horn. Chucho ran the middle. A board member came out shouting that this was hysteria, that Tansy's newsletter said settling, and Noelle put the flashlight on the man's own foundation, where the wall had opened a gap you could put a hand into since dinner, and the man stopped shouting and started carrying his children to the car. The cove let go at 3:40 in the morning. It did not come as a wave. It came as the whole lower slope simply leaving, a slow, enormous, grinding migration of saturated red earth and trees and one swimming pool, sliding down the old scar and across the runout and into 7 houses that were, by then, dark and empty and unlocked, their driveways bare. The debris stopped 40 feet from Noelle's own porch because the cove had finally finished the move it had been bracing against for 300 years, and the only thing it took was buildings. Not one person on that mountain was under it. They had been woken by arithmetic instead of by the roar. After that, the hearing was almost a formality, but Audrey ran it like the matter of life it had been. The buried geotechnical report came in first, in Ridgeline's own files, beside the emails telling the sales team to close the upper lots before the wet season raises questions. The captive arborist, under oath, admitted he had inspected the oak 4 days after it was already on the ground. Ridgeline's glossy expert did not say he couldn't recall. He argued, at length and with charts, that the tree had been immaterial, and then Audrey laid Chucho's inclinometer trace beside the felling date, and the slope's acceleration began the very week the roots stopped holding, and the expert's own curve testified against him while he was still defending it. Then Noelle put the oak on the stand. She set the cross-section under a courtroom document camera and read it the way she had read 300 years of climate out of dead timber for the government. Here the reaction wood, dense and off-center, built up against the downhill pull decade after decade, the tree throwing its whole long life into staying upright on a moving slope. Here the rings crowding tight in the drought years. Here a healed scar from a small slump in 1973. The same year, Dell's ledger said, the log road had buckled and been regraded. The oak had been an instrument, and it had recorded the mountain's intent to move for a century and a half. And they had cut down the witness precisely because it stood in the way of a view. Dell read 3 pages of mill measurements in his slow, flat voice. The aerials, the radar, the inclinometer, and the rings all gave the same date in 4 different languages. The court found the association and ridgeline liable for the dangerous condition and the concealment. The buried report and the disclosure fraud went to the United States Attorney because the upper lots had been marketed to buyers across state lines on a mountain the seller knew was sliding. Ridgeline's principal was arraigned that spring, and Noelle drove down to the federal courthouse to sit in the gallery because she wanted to watch a man who had sold a moving mountain hear it read back to him as a crime. Tansy Caldwell lost the board, the title of community curator she had given herself, and the villa whose deck now hung over open air. But because the developer had held her guarantees and her debt over her like a cocked hammer, the prosecutor let her plead to a count that kept her out of a cell. Noelle did not push for more. She had spent her life learning to tell the slow, honest failure of wood from the fast, dishonest failure of people, and she had no taste for grinding down the one who had only been pushed. She did not move away, and she did not fence the ruined slope and call it justice. She used the judgment to do the one thing the mountain had been asking for all along. Real drainage went in, and rock-filled gabions along the toe, and, where the great oak had stood for 3 centuries, a stand of deep-rooted oaks and hickories, young and thin as broom handles, driven into the scar to grow new anchors into the wound. The county passed an ordinance that winter, requiring landslide risk disclosure on every mountain parcel, and barring cosmetic removal of trees on load-bearing slopes without a real geotechnical sign-off. Dell's mill ledgers were scanned into the county record, so the cove's long memory could never be called settling again. Chucho got the monitoring contract and a raise and pretended neither pleased him. Audrey took 3 more disclosure cases off the ruling. Dell was hired, at 74, to consult on what he called slope memory, which he insisted was just paying attention, which he had been doing for free his whole life. Tansy, before she sold her cracked house honestly and with full disclosure this time, left a banker's box on Noelle's porch without a word. Every glossy brochure she had ever handed a buyer promising an unobstructed view, the paper trail that helped hang the men above her, and drove down the mountain and did not come back. A year on a clear morning with no fog at all, Noelle sat on the healing slope where the young oaks had taken, and a class of 4th graders from the Valley School came up the county road to count rings with her. She had the great oak's cross-section mounted under glass at the school now, and beside it, instead of a brass plate, hung her own watercolor of the disc, 300 rings in fine brown ink, with 1 line of her handwriting beneath it. She showed the children the dark, off-center band of reaction wood and let them put their fingers on 150 years of a tree holding a mountain still. Then she walked them to the youngest oak on the toe and bent back its first thin season of growth. "That ring there," she said, "is the year the mountain started learning to hold on again." One of the children asked if the trees could really hold up a whole hill. "For about 300 years at a time," Noelle said, "if nobody decides they're spoiling the view." Here's the part that stays with me. Noelle didn't beat them with a lawyer or a clever filing. She beat them with a tree they had already killed. The oak couldn't be intimidated, couldn't be bought, couldn't be talked in circles on a witness stand. It had spent 150 years laying down reaction wood against the pull of the slope, recording the mountain's intention to move, in a language only a dendrochronologist could read. And when they cut it down to improve a view, they cut down the one witness that couldn't be cross-examined into doubt. That's the quiet brilliance of it. The evidence was the victim.
And notice what actually carried the case. Not the courtroom. The inclinometer at 2 a.m. Tansy and the developer were fighting about sight lines and property values, the things you can see from a deck. Noelle was reading the things you can't. Root cohesion, the toe of an old landslide, the slow creep of saturated earth. The law had a name for what the developer did, and it wasn't removing a hazard. It was disclosure fraud. Selling lots across state lines on a slope the seller knew was reactivating, which is exactly the kind of concealment that turns a local nuisance into a federal case. A tree is not a hazard because it spoils your view. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between 40 houses and the bottom of the hill. What gets me is that she could have just been right and let them drown in it. Instead, she went door to door in the rain with a penciled list and got 7 families out before the cove let go. Woken, as she put it, by arithmetic instead of by the roar. The win wasn't the verdict. The win was that nobody was under the slope when it finally moved. So here's the question worth sitting with. The next time someone tells you a beautiful old tree is a liability and needs to come down for the view, would you think to ask what it might be holding up? Most people never do. The mountain, as always, kept its own records and waited for someone who could read them.